Help me praise him. Good God. Yes, sir. Thank you for my uprising and thank you for my downsetting. Thank you for how you brought me and thank you for how you taught me and thank you how you led me and how you fed me. You made ways out of no ways. Let me praise you. Let me thank you. Let me honor you. I came to give you the sacrifice of praise.
Gentlemen, it's me, Jermaine, and welcome back for another Bible study lesson. This week I want to talk to us about Peter. Peter, out of all of the disciples, is my very favorite disciple. I find that Peter is relatable to me. I find that out of all of the disciples, my response to this God in the flesh, this awesome experience, is much like Peter. So, who is Peter, you may ask? Many of you may know him. It's without a question that he is the most mentioned and most popular disciple out of all of the Gospels: Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. His name means heard in Hebrew. Interesting, because he is the very first disciple that hears Jesus Christ. The very first one that is summoned by Jesus Christ. Where? Out there on the sea. In his particular trade, Peter is a fisherman. And so on this particular day, this encounter with Jesus, Jesus notices Peter. At this point, Peter does not know Jesus, does not recognize who he is. All that he knows is that someone is given instruction about his trade from the shore. So Jesus says to Peter, cast your net on the right side of the boat. Now imagine this. These were fishermen by trade, and here is someone that is a complete stranger calling from the shore, telling them how they ought to fish. And Peter's response to Jesus is, we've been catching fish all day long. But if you instruct me, Master, to cast my net on the right side of the boat, I will do just that. They follow the instruction, although reluctant. And once they do follow the instruction, they catch so many fish that they call other boats. Him and his brother Andrew, they call other boats to help them with all of this fish that they have caught. And even with that, they caught so much fish that the boats began to sink. Peter, he sees this, and he comes and he falls down at Jesus' feet. And he says, go away from me. Now, this is the best response out of all of the disciples. Another reason why he's my favorite, because of his response to God in the flesh. He says, go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And Jesus later says, don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. The very first disciple. Let me tell you some other things, interesting facts about this disciple. Simon, which is his original name, is giving a new name. None of the other disciples get a new name, but Simon gets a new name. Jesus names him as Peter, which in Aramaic and also in Greek means Caiaphas. That name means rock. Peter is the spokesman for all of the disciples. Peter was just an ordinary fisherman with no education, no accolades, no high esteem position like any of the other or some of the other disciples in society. Peter is the most mentioned disciple out of all of the Gospels. Peter witnesses the transformation of Christ on the mountaintop. Peter is included with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Peter is told by Jesus on this rock I shall build my church. Peter, whose name means rock. On Peter, that means I will build my church. Peter is the first to encounter the empty tomb after the resurrection. Peter is the one who walks on the water towards Jesus Christ. It is Peter, out of all the disciples, that correctly identifies after he asks his disciples, "Who am I?" He says, "You are the Messiah of God." Out of all of that, Peter himself is not without flaw. Peter protests Jesus dying on the cross. He says, "This will never happen." And Peter is met with rebuke. Out of all the disciples, the strongest one, "Get behind me, Satan." Although Peter walks on water miraculously, Peter gets frightened by the waves of the ocean and the storm and is told, rebuked by Jesus after he begins to sink, "O man of little faith." In the upper room, Peter declares that he will never betray Jesus Christ. But Peter ends up denying Christ 3 times. Peter falls asleep after being one of the few invited to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray with Jesus before his passion. He falls asleep. At the critical hour that Jesus needs him to pray, he falls asleep. Peter takes a sword and defends Jesus against the soldiers using violence. Peter. Now, after Peter denies Jesus Christ 3 times, it is Peter who, out of all of the disciples, has the greatest remorse. Think about that for a minute. He was the lead disciple. He was the spokesman. He was the first out of all of them. The one that declared God's identity denies him 3 times. Peter ultimately is restored. When we look at today's text, it comes from John 21. And this is Pentecostal Sunday. Out of all of the texts, this, in my opinion, is the ultimate text to highlight the importance of the coming of the Holy Ghost. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. He says, "I am going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We're going with you." So they all went out and got into the boat, and by that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood at the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called to them, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they answered, not recognizing that this was Jesus. He instructed them, "Throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him. jumping down to further into verse 15, he says, while they were eating the fish, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. He refers back to him in his original name. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him on the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. This passage is known as the restoration of Peter. Interesting enough, we understand that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And here in this text, we find Peter and Jesus Christ back. Peter, distraught and confused and living in regret on the sea, having caught nothing, immobilized because of what has transpired in Peter's life of denying Christ 3 times. Jesus asked Peter 3 times to restore Peter. Jesus knew very, very well that Peter loved him. Peter loved him. This was the first disciple. This was the one who witnessed the transfiguration on the mountaintop. This was the disciple who was the spokesman. This was the disciple who was the leader. He knew he loved him. But out of all of this, what is Jesus trying to teach and emphasize by repeating, do you love me 3 times? He is trying to get Peter to understand that love comes with not only with restoration, not only is Peter being restored, but Peter has to understand that love comes with responsibility. Responsibility of taking care of God's people. If you love me, then take care of my people. So on this day of Pentecost, as we sit and we reflect in many churches across the nation, will dance and shout and speak in tongues. But the same question is asked to every single individual person, every single believer, every single church body. Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than speaking in tongues? Do you love me more than dancing and shouting? Do you love me more than your trade? Well, if you love him, if we love him, if the church loves him, then we ought to feed the lambs. We ought to love the lambs. We ought to take care of the sheep. We've got responsibility. And Pentecost is more than shouting and speaking in tongues and dancing and being in church and celebrating just one day that the Holy Ghost fell upon the believers. It was the Holy Ghost that enabled the disciples. It was the Holy Ghost that enabled those initial believers who received the Holy Ghost to act. That's why the next book following the gospel is Acts, the Acts of the Holy Ghost. So in all of your Holy Ghost filled, tongue talking, dancing and shouting, do not forget that we must take care of the sheep. We must take care, advance God's people, meet the needs of the hungry, take care of the orphan. This is what it means to have piety, spirituality, and most importantly, to emphasize the Holy Ghost. See you next week. Subscribe. I'll talk to you next week. Thank you for tuning in. Share the message of God's news.